Welcome back, everyone, to What Matters Most. After a long pause and a summer of rest where we decided to take some time, we're back for season 2. This is going to be an exciting year, a lot of content. Get ready for really interesting speakers. And I hope you're going to come with us in this journey of understanding, transformation, learning, and hopefully getting us a little bit closer to the Geulah. So today I'm going to be alone, and I want to talk to you a little bit about a topic that is not easy to talk about. So I'm going to do my best. Forgive me if I make mistakes or there is something that may not be fully accurate. And that is the topic of free will. I know it's a difficult one, and hence why I want to take step by step in this conversation. Free will is usually put into context against determinism, right? Do we have free will? Is our world deterministic? Do we live under a pure cause and effect type of reality? And if we do have free will, then what does it mean? What aspects are we given to be able to choose about, right? It's a paradox. And the first thing I want to share and say is that we are not truly able to understand the paradox, right? I will say off the bat, I am a believer that free will exists. Now, it is not that the only thing that exists is free will, just as it is not the only thing that exists is determinism, right? These are, in essence, two sides of the same coin, right? As we talked about in our first episode, these are the duality, one of the dualities of life, and in essence, they end up converging into oneness, right? We can think somehow easily that determinism exists in a way of saying, well, everything that is not on my control, right? That to me looks deterministic, right? Other people's choices are not in my free will. So in some sense, you can think of free will as a very individualistic kind of situation, because everything else is something that essentially God brings upon your life, if you wish to think about it like that. Now, free will for me, and based on content from our sages and some other Kabbalistic sources, free will is not just about the mundane act of choosing something, like I want to drink this Coke, or I'm gonna stop to look at this toy, or whatever like that. Free will is truly enacted whenever the decision involves a certain aspect of difficulty. And a specific difficulty is a challenge of overcoming what our human/physical desires, or if you wish to call them animalistic desires, are calling us into, right? Of course, we have our needs, and no one is saying that we shouldn't satisfy our needs. That would be ridiculous. We live in a body. We need to respect that and be aware of that. Of course, we're not just spiritual entities. We need to be grounded in our understanding of that. That's very important. And yet, there are many times in our life when we encounter a type of struggle, of a choice. Do I help someone at the expense of my own interest? Do I stop for myself from eating this thing that I'm just craving, because I know deep inside that it's not a good thing for me in the longer term, right? Am I choosing to live my life intentionally, or am I just reacting to the way that life is guiding me to live, right? Of course, this is never going to be black and white. But this is where, in the bigger picture of your life, the process of healing comes in, right? When you're going to be you're making some decisions that are aligned more with your soul, with your say, let's say like higher soul, then you're going to be overcoming your ego or your lower soul, your physical soul. And that is something that is appreciated by your soul and aligns you with God's will, almost. We need to consider within this concept of free will, we need to consider the idea of responsibility, right? Why were we given free will? This is an important question. Like, if free will exists, and why does it exist? What is its role in the creation and the development of the world? Well, this is the first thing we encounter in the Torah, basically, in that God actually created us, created human, in order to be co-creators of this world. And I mentioned this, I think, before, but our Kabbalists and the Talmudists have explained that we are currently living in sort of the equivalent of the sixth day of creation. And in fact, we are now up to the test to continue building this until we get to the seventh day, which is the day of rest. And that's where the redemption or the Geulah is going to come. Baal HaSulam explains that the purpose of creation is for us to essentially heal our souls, to bring a certain level of tikkun to the world. If you're familiar with the idea of klipot, or if you're familiar with other concepts in Kabbalah, this is essentially what the purpose of creation is. Our soul comes down in order to enact a certain change in the world and in itself that will make the world better, that will get us closer to the knowledge of God and connect us to the consciousness of unity and oneness. Okay? This is, by the way, something that is very reflected in the Matrix movie. Because in one of the scenes when Neo goes to see the Oracle asks Neo a question and says, "Why are you here?" And Neo stops for a second and says, "Well, you already know the answer." She says, "Well, of course, what type of oracle would I be if I didn't know the answer?" And Neo says, "So then what does it matter that I give you the answer?" And what the oracle says is quite amazing and summarizes all of these ideas. Is the oracle tells Neo, you believe that you've come to this life in order to make the decisions. But in fact, you've come to this life in order to understand why you've made the decisions that you have already made. And this puts in contrast exactly the free will and the determinism. It's like, if I've already made the decisions because my soul at a higher level has already made these decisions, then how am I supposed to have free will? But the idea that you're coming in order to understand something deeper about that process of your soul is quite radical. And it's quite an incredible way of thinking about it. Now, the sages say that we must have in mind, with respect to our decision, we must have in mind the idea of responsibility. How responsible are we for this specific decision? Who is it going to impact? How is it going to impact? Are we doing this from a place of truth, from a place of good or evil, etc.? What is our intention? Because that's what's going to mark the ability to transcend the ego and the ability to say, well, this is the decision that is aligned with my soul. And until we don't make that decision, we wouldn't understand why we made that decision in the first place, right? Not long ago, I was actually in a retreat, and there was a beautiful sort of path to a forest, a shala, and one of the quotes there really impacted me, and said, the reason why time exists is so that we do not have to experience everything at once. I'm going to repeat that. The reason why time exists is so that we do not need to experience everything at once. Let's break it down. Why does time exist? Well, we know that time for us is linear, right? And in some sense, what gives us the paradigm of time is the ability to choose, because choice brings change. You're changing a state by choosing something different, right? And the fact that we have memory allows us to think of the past, and the fact that we have imagination allows us to think of the future and imagine how things are going to be, or envision how things are going to look like, what is our will, etc. But in fact, we know that the only real point in time is the present, because you're always living in the present. Now, we consider the present to be evolving, but from the perspective of God and of spirituality, the present is fully still. It's eternal. There is nothing else but the present. So if we didn't have this conceptuality of time, all of life would be compressed into a single moment. And hence you can see why in God's realm, determinism is true. But in our realm, free will is also true, because we do expand into time, at least conceptually, in our perspective. And that is something that probably helps us reconcile a little bit all of this spiritual process. Now, in some sense, we can differentiate for a second, right? And say, well, what happens to us, right? How do these two combine? How does free will and determinism combine? What happens to us is what we said can be thought of determinism, because I don't have control over it. And that's in some sense the what, right? The setting for my existence, right? It is the points in time that are going to define certain aspects of my life, where I was born, what family I live with, or I was born to, who are, the people I encounter in my school. Life is about opportunity, but the opportunities come to you. You don't choose them. You can choose to engage with an opportunity, right? And the choosing itself is the how do you experience life? How do we go about moving into that aspect of choice, right? So this actually brings us to the next question or point that I want to make, which is related to how Rambam takes or considers the idea of free will. For Rambam is a sage, or a philosophist, a Jewish philosopher. He says that the idea that God knows everything and what choices we're going to make does not imply we do not have free will, does not cancel our free will. In fact, because what we said, his knowledge is not bound by time. His knowledge is not bound by our limited intellect and our limited life experience. And both of these can be true. God can know everything from outside of time, and we are determined by free will inside of this timeline. So there is a struggle here. You can see. How do we choose? When do we choose? There's another layer to this conversation, and that is what, in fact, Rabbi Soloveitchik brings into the conversation with his book Kol Dodofek. And Rabbi Soloveitchik was an incredible rabbi and philosopher and, knowledgeable person in all Torah and Jewish content. And he was the president of Yeshiva University as well, as many other, titles that I'm not fully remembering now. But in Kol Dodi Dofek, he's trying to make an argument about the idea of fate versus destiny. Now, I'm going to read a quote and sort of hopefully it will be explained what the differences are. What is fate and what is destiny? He says, when man finds himself in the grip of a force that he cannot resist or evade, he is subject to fate. When he confronts that same force with strength and determination, transforming it into an instrument of redemption, he is guided by destiny. Right? So in some sense, what Soloveitchik is doing is bringing another perspective. Like, is it really about the choice? Is it really about what is choice? Is it like when something happens to you? He says, when something happens to you that is causing you struggle or pain, how are you reacting to that? Right? And this is what brings together the idea of responsibility. It's what brings together the idea of free choice, of free will. And in essence, he's saying, like, when you take ownership and responsibility over that reaction and decision, you are in fact sort of transforming the fate into destiny. You're choosing to live your life with intentionality. And that's one of the ways we can reconcile this. Fate is what happens to us, and destiny is what we make of it when it happens to us. He says, another quote, the difference between fate and destiny is not in the events themselves, but in man's response to them. Fate is the blind submission to external circumstance. Destiny is the active creation of a life imbued with meaning. And I want to leave you guys with that thought as well. Free will gives us purpose and meaning. A life without free will is a life without meaning. Because what would drive us in order to become better people if we know that we cannot choose anyway? The sages also say that, as I mentioned before, we need to tackle every decision as if we had full free will and responsibility over it. But then they also say that once things have once the act or the decision has been made, in fact, one has the responsibility to do this kind of understanding of what was the right, whether it was right or not, take responsibility over that, but also let go of it in understanding that, in fact, God is the one that put us in that position and that sort of got us to make that decision too. Because it's exactly what needed to happen, right? When I was younger and I started thinking about this, for me, destiny wasn't something that is like, oh, it's written, right? It was essentially saying, in the span of the timeline of my life, destiny is basically saying the only thing that, what happened was the only thing that could have happened. Because that's exactly what needed to happen in order for me to be here. And when I'm expanding the timeline that in fact is fully concentrated into a present moment, then I am just sort of in service of that series of events. But when I see this from a place of responsibility, I know that I am taking the right path and I'm aligning my soul higher and higher with the divine element of creation. And I'm co-creating, in fact, that life, because if I consider my soul as part of the collective of souls and consciousness of humanity, that is what is going to bring me into that purpose, the idea of having that free choice. So in a way, Kabbalah gives us this metaphysical reconciliation that determinism and free will are one in the context of eternity and transcendence of time. And Soloveitchik gives us a bit of an existential or practical reconciliation. In fact, he says, right, like if fate is what life gives you and hands over to you, but you have the responsibility to take this into your hands and create a destiny, which is how you exercise freedom in response to what happens to you. That's why it's called free will. It's like you can react. It's not free because you just you're free to choose. It's like you have a responsibility without that freedom. And in fact, this is something very well known in Judaism, that like bringing limits and boundaries and constraints to an experience of life brings even more freedom to your life, right? Contrary to popular thought that freedom means I can do whatever I want, right? And so if I can just read you this sentence, we are fated into existence, but destined through our choices. In the divine eye, the two are one. In the human heart, they must be wrestled. They must be wrestled with until we transform suffering into creativity and necessity into freedom. And this is very powerful because this is exactly how we are co-creators of this life and reality with God. By making by taking every single choice and decision as the most important decision in our lives. The sages would say that, the Jewish sages say that we need to act as if every single decision, no matter how small it is, can tip the scale of humanity for receiving the Mashiach and having the full redemption of our lives. That's how much responsibility we carry. It is not up to us to finish the creation, but it is also also in our responsibility to take some type of ownership over it. And this is how we're going to get to the Geulah. Each one of us needs to be healing in this process of choice. We would not be able to do the tikkun of our neshamot if we were not able to make these free choices. So I hope this was interesting to you. And I hope that we will continue this conversation. I'm definitely going to come back with more thoughts around this. But I just wanted to say that this is one of the most important topics, that we need to continue talking about it in every dinner table, in every forum, in every space, community, digital space. Many of us Jews are struggling today because of how our world has turned into a world of misinformation, a world of untruth, a world of subjective morality. And many times, free will is what essentially drove us there. But for me, in my perspective, it's all coming from God. And that's something hard to accept as well. So I need to transform that fate into destiny. And for me, it means to come out and talk about this. And for the Jewish people, it means for us to come into unity and to become close again. Go beyond the difficulties and the hate that we're experiencing and start loving each other again. So I hope you all have a great month of Elul. I hope you all go through a process of teshuvah. This Rosh Hashanah, Shana Tova. Have a good new year, good new Jewish New Year. And may you also go through a healing and meaningful Yom Kippur. Thank you very much.